Today I'm going to be installing this XRC clutch cover on my 2017 KTM 250XC. This is the XRC clutch cover I'm going to be installing. The main advantage over the stock KTM clutch cover is it's much stronger. This area in particular is much beefier. If I flip it over, you can see it's CNC'd machined out of a solid piece of aluminium. Very, very strong construction and beautifully made. Installing the clutch cover is pretty straightforward. I did go ahead and buy a new clutch cover gasket. I'll put the part number in the description of the video. One detail you do need to pay attention to is the length of the bolts, particularly on this one, and I'll go into detail about that later on. I recommend before changing the clutch cover that you wash your bike and remove any dirt around the clutch cover area. You should also note that there's oil behind the clutch cover, so if you take the cover off with the bike standing up, oil will come out. I've leant the bike over to the left-hand side and I'm resting the handlebars on a work stand. So even if I take the cover off, no oil will come out. Okay, the first step of the install is to remove the original clutch cover, and you should note that the bolts holding the cover on are all different lengths. So what I always do is make a template like this, and when I take the bolts out, I put them in a template, and then when I come to put them back in, it's very easy to know which bolt goes where. And I remove them in a crisscross pattern. It just helps prevent damage to the clutch cover. Once you've got them all loosened slightly, you can go ahead and start removing them. And I always leave the spring connected to the clutch cover and remove this bolt last. And then you can just disconnect the spring easily. And here you can see the different length bolts. Okay, one important thing to note is the clutch covers are actually different from year to year. So on the left is my 2017 250XC clutch cover, and on the right is my 2019 250 TPI clutch cover. And the difference is the thickness of this tab. So on the 2017 model is about 13 millimeters. And on the 2018 and 2019 models, it's increased to about 18 millimeters. On the 2017 model clutch cover, in this position a 60mm bolt is used, and this position 55mm bolt is used. One issue is that if you swap the bolts round and put the 60mm bolt in this position, it actually goes right through to the starter motor, and if you screw it in, it will break the starter motor, and you'll end up needing to replace it. So it can be very costly just swapping these bolts around. I think the reason KTM went to the new design is that both the bolts are 60mm, so there's no chance of damaging the starter motor by swapping the bolts around. So before you fit your XRC clutch cover, measure this tab and compare it to the clutch cover you have. So I've done that, and it's about 5mm deeper. So I'm going to be using a 60mm bolt in this position. If you want to double check that the bolt you're planning to use is no problem, you can measure the depth of this hole. So this is the one that goes through to the starter motor. And using some calipers, you can use this part to measure the depth of the hole. So extend it out, make sure it goes right down to the bottom of the hole, and then you can measure the depth. And it's pretty much 45 millimeters. So I've got 45mm here, and on my XRC clutch cover, the tab that mounts here is 18. So 45 plus 18 is 63. So I know that using a 60mm bolt, I've got 3mm clearance, so that's going to be no problem at all. Okay, I've installed the new gasket in the XRC clutch cover, so I'm ready to install it now. Before you do put it on, make sure there's no debris on the sealing surfaces around, and if there is, clean it off thoroughly. So the first step is to attach the rear brake pedal spring to the clutch cover. And then getting the bolts from your template, ensuring you've got the right bolts, you can install the bolt closest to the spring first, just to hold it in place. And then you can start installing the other bolts as well. Okay, once you've got all the bolts hand tight, you can go ahead and torque them to 8 Newton meters. And I like to use a crisscross pattern for the final torquing. And once you've torqued all the bolts, go around again and check they're torqued correctly. I did measure the internal oil volume of the XRC cover, and it's pretty much the same as stock, so you don't need to make any oil adjustments. And one last check is the rear brake pedal. Make sure it's not interfering with the clutch cover. You can see there I have plenty of clearance, so no problem at all. So that's the install complete. I think the cover looks great on the bike, and it certainly appears to be very high quality and should be a lot stronger than the stock cover. So I'm really pleased with it.